The maid's hands trembled as she held the small, glowing object close to the boy's ear. The room was silent. The millionaire's wife gasped as her son blinked, his lips parting, eyes widening as though he could suddenly feel something no one else could. Then, a soft sound escaped his mouth, a whisper that froze everyone. "Mom?" Danny said, his voice fragile, unsure, but real. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. His mother dropped to her knees, tears spilling down her face. The father stood frozen near the door, his phone slipping from his grasp. The maid, Maria, looked at the boy with tears glistening in her eyes. What did you do?" the father whispered. Maria's voice shook. "I didn't do anything, sir. I just..." Before she could finish, the camera faded out and a narrator's voice broke through gently. "Miracles don't always come from the powerful. Sometimes they come from those you least expect. Watch till the end to see how one woman's faith changed everything. And while you're here, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below." The screen brightened, showing a massive mansion overlooking the city. Cars glided past the gates, security guards bowed respectfully, and maids hurried around carrying baskets and fresh linens. Inside the mansion, everything gleamed. Marble floors, gold-trimmed furniture, and endless silence. Not the calm kind, but the kind that felt heavy. The Williams family had money, but not peace. George Williams, the head of the family, was a man who'd built his empire from scratch. His name was known in every corner of New York's real estate world. But despite all his power, one thing had defeated him: his son's silence. Danny was 8, born deaf. Doctors had said he'd never hear, never speak, and might never live a normal life. His mother, Victoria, prayed endlessly, traveling from clinic to clinic, but every answer was the same. George, however, stopped believing long ago. To him, hope was just another lie rich people bought to feel better. That morning, the mansion was restless. A new maid had arrived, short, soft-spoken, dressed simply, holding an old leather bag. Her name was Maria. Victoria greeted her kindly. "You'll be helping around the house, mostly with Danny. He needs company." Maria smiled. "Yes, ma'am, I'll do my best." When she first met Danny, he was sitting by the window, sketching in silence. He didn't look up when she entered. He didn't even seem to notice her presence. Maria watched him for a moment, then quietly sat beside him. She picked up a pencil and drew beside him. Not speaking, not gesturing, just letting her pencil move. When Danny glanced at her paper, she smiled and pointed at his drawing of a bird. She mimed wings flapping. He blinked, then nodded, drawing the bird again, this time smiling slightly. That was their beginning. Over the next few days, she learned his rhythm. He didn't like being touched suddenly. He didn't respond to pity. But he loved to draw, to build things with his blocks, and to sit near the garden where wind moved through the trees. Maria noticed something about him. He could feel vibrations. When she hummed softly, though he couldn't hear it, he would look toward her, almost sensing it through the air. She began using gentle patterns, tapping her fingers on the table in rhythm so he could feel her presence. Slowly, he started responding. Victoria watched from the hallway one afternoon as Maria and Danny sat laughing. Well, Danny's version of laughing, soft puffs of breath and bright eyes. Her heart swelled, but George only frowned. "She's getting too close," he said. Victoria sighed. "She's helping him, George. You've seen the change." "He's still deaf," he snapped. "Don't fill his head with false hope." Maria overheard him one evening, but said nothing. She had seen this kind of pain before. A father afraid to hope because he couldn't handle more disappointment. That night, while tucking Danny into bed, she wrote in his notebook, "You're stronger than anyone thinks." He read it, smiled faintly, and wrote back, "You believe that?" She nodded. "Always." Weeks passed. Danny grew attached to Maria, following her around the house. She taught him sign gestures she'd learned online, and he began using them to communicate better. The family noticed, but George refused to admit it mattered. One afternoon, a group of doctors visited. They tried a new hearing aid prototype. It failed, again. George stormed out. When Maria found Victoria crying later, she simply placed a hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, sometimes what we wait for doesn't come the way we expect. Maybe it's already here, just unseen." Victoria smiled weakly. "You talk like you've seen miracles before." Maria looked out the window. "I've lived one." Before she could explain, Danny ran into the room holding a small drawing. It was of Maria standing beside him, a bright sun over their heads. Victoria laughed through her tears and hugged her son. Maria smiled quietly, but her eyes held something deeper, as if she knew this peace wouldn't last. That evening, George came home earlier than usual. Freaking, he watched Danny and Maria playing with blocks in the living room. For a brief moment, he softened until he saw the pendant around Maria's neck. "What's that?" he asked sharply. She touched it instinctively. "Just something my grandmother gave me, sir." He frowned. "Take it off while you're working. This is a professional home, not a church." Maria hesitated but obeyed. She slipped the pendant off and placed it gently in her pocket. Danny watched the exchange, confused. When George walked away, Maria smiled at the boy reassuringly, but her hand remained over her pocket, protecting the pendant as if it meant more than words could explain. That night, thunder rolled outside, and Danny couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring into the rain, clutching his sketchbook. Maria entered quietly, holding a blanket. She draped it over him and knelt beside him. He wrote in his notebook, "Why is Dad angry all the time?" Maria sighed. "Because sometimes people are afraid to believe again. When life hurts them too many times, they stop listening, even to love." He nodded slowly. Then he drew something. 2 stick figures holding hands under the rain. He handed it to her. She smiled, her heart breaking a little at how much this silent boy could say without words. Outside, the storm grew heavier. Neither of them knew that by morning, everything would change. The next morning came gray and quiet, the kind of morning that felt heavy before anything even happened. Maria walked down the long hallway carrying a tray of breakfast for Danny. As she reached his door, she noticed it was slightly open. Inside, Victoria sat beside the bed, brushing Danny's hair while he still slept. But his face was pale, paler than usual. His breathing was shallow. "Ma'am?" Maria said softly. Victoria turned, her eyes already wet. "He's burning up. It started early this morning. The doctor's on his way." Maria placed the tray down, touching the boy's forehead gently. "He's so cold." "He was fine last night," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling. "What happened?" George rushed in minutes later, phone pressed to his ear. "I've called every specialist in the city," he barked. "Someone will fix this. They have to." Maria moved aside, watching the fear in the man's eyes, the fear that came when money couldn't buy control. The doctors arrived, filling the room with medical terms and sterile voices. Machines beeped, wires tangled, but Maria stayed at the corner, silent, praying quietly under her breath. After what felt like hours, one of the doctors stepped back, shaking his head. "There's an infection spreading fast. We're doing our best, but his immune system isn't responding." Victoria broke down completely. George clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. "Do something," he shouted. "We are," the doctor said gently, "but you should prepare for the worst." The words hit like thunder. Maria's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She couldn't stand there doing nothing. When the doctors left to get more equipment, she stepped closer to the bed. "Danny," she whispered, brushing a tear from his cheek. "You can fight this. You hear me? You're stronger than they think." George turned sharply. "Get out of the room," he snapped. Maria froze. "I said get out!" Victoria touched his arm. "George," but he shook her off. "I won't have this woman whispering nonsense while my son's dying." Maria's lips trembled. She bowed her head and left the room quietly. But in the hallway, she pressed her back against the wall, whispering, "God, please, not this child." Hours passed. The doctors kept returning with new updates, none of them good. By nightfall, Danny was barely conscious. The air inside the room felt heavy with despair. When George finally stepped out to take another phone call, Maria slipped back in. She carried her small leather bag, the one she never opened in front of anyone. Victoria looked up, exhausted, too weak to argue. "Maria." Maria knelt beside the bed. "Ma'am, I know you don't know me well, but please, just trust me this once." Victoria hesitated. "What are you going to do?" "Something my grandmother taught me," Maria said quietly. "It's not magic, it's faith." She reached into her bag and pulled out the pendant, the same one George had asked her to remove. Under the dim bedside light, it glimmered softly, warm and almost alive. Victoria stared. "What is that?" "My grandmother said it was blessed by a missionary long ago. She called it the light of mercy. She used it when my baby sister was dying, and she lived." Victoria's hands shook. "Do you think it'll work?" Maria took a deep breath. "Only if we believe it can." She placed the pendant near Danny's ear, closed her eyes, and began to pray softly. Her words were barely audible, but her voice carried a strange peace, the kind that silences chaos. Victoria held her son's hand tightly, whispering her own silent prayer. The room seemed to still, the machines quieted, the air thick with something unseen. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Danny's fingers twitched. Victoria gasped. "Did you see that?" Maria didn't stop praying. Her hand hovered near his head, trembling, as a faint glow spread from the pendant to her palm. Danny's lips parted. "Mom?" The sound was weak but real. Victoria froze. Tears welled in her eyes before she screamed for George. "George, he spoke! George, he just spoke!" George burst in, disbelief written all over his face. "What are you talking about?" Danny blinked slowly, turning toward the sound of his mother's voice. His hand reached out. "Mom?" The man's jaw dropped. No, this can't be." Maria lowered her head, whispering through tears. "Thank you." George stumbled forward, staring at the glowing pendant in her hand. "What did you do to him?" Maria looked up, her eyes red. "I prayed." He shook his head violently. "No, that's impossible. You did something else." Victoria clutched Danny in her arms, crying uncontrollably. "He heard me, George. He heard me." But George couldn't process it. He backed away, whispering, "I don't understand," before storming out of the room. The doctors came rushing back after hearing the noise, and their confusion only deepened when they tested Danny's hearing. Everything showed normal. It's like his auditory nerves just woke up," one of them stammered. "This defies everything we know." Maria stepped aside quietly, not wanting attention. Victoria hugged her tightly. "You saved my son." Maria smiled faintly. "No, ma'am. Love did." That night, George didn't come home. He stayed at his office, sitting in darkness, replaying everything in his head. His son's voice, his wife's tears, the maid's glowing pendant. None of it made sense. By morning, when he finally walked back through the door, the house was peaceful. Danny was sitting on the couch, wearing headphones, laughing. Actually laughing. Victoria sat beside him, smiling through tears as she showed him how to speak simple words. Maria stood near the doorway, watching quietly. George stopped in the middle of the room, overwhelmed. His throat tightened as he whispered, "He can really hear." Victoria nodded, crying again. "He's repeating words. He hears us, George. He hears us." Maria's gaze met his. For a second, he wanted to thank her, but pride froze his lips. Instead, he muttered, "You should pack your things. I don't know what you did, but I don't want anything else happening in this house." Victoria turned sharply. He looked away. "I need time to think." Maria's heart sank, but she nodded. "Yes, sir." She walked away quietly, but Danny saw her leaving. He ran after her, tugging her hand. "Maria," he said softly. It was the clearest word he'd spoken yet. She smiled through tears and signed, "Be brave." He shook his head, tears filling his eyes. She hugged him gently, whispering, "You'll be okay now." Victoria followed her to the door. "Please don't go. We owe you everything." Maria smiled sadly. "You don't owe me, just love him enough for both of us." She turned and walked out into the soft morning light. The camera faded out and the narrator's voice returned softly. Sometimes the people who change our lives don't stay forever. They just come long enough to remind us that miracles still happen. If you've ever witnessed something you couldn't explain, tell us your story in the comments. And remember to like and subscribe for more inspiring tales of faith, and hope. The scene shifted to evening. George stood alone on the balcony, watching the city lights. Behind him, he heard footsteps, his wife's. "She left," Victoria said quietly. He nodded. "I know." "She saved him, George, and you pushed her away." He swallowed hard. "I don't understand what happened." "Not everything needs to be understood," she whispered. "Some things just need to be believed." Days turned into weeks, and though the house was quieter without Maria, something had undeniably changed. Danny could hear, truly hear. He laughed more, spoke slowly but clearly, and spent hours listening to the world that had always been silent to him. The ticking clock, the rain on the window, his mother's lullabies, everything was new. Victoria was radiant again. But George carried a shadow. He couldn't sleep. Every night he'd walk past the guest room where Maria once stayed. The bed was neatly made, the scent of her lavender soap still faint in the air. He'd sit there in silence, remembering the night she prayed. The way her hands glowed, the calm in her eyes, the impossible moment his son spoke for the first time. None of it left his mind. One night, as he sat there, Danny's small voice echoed down the hall. "Dad?" George turned. "You're supposed to be in bed, buddy." Danny smiled. I couldn't sleep. George patted the space beside him and Danny climbed up. The boy's voice was soft, unsure. He was still learning to use words. Dad, he said, fidgeting. Can I tell you something? Of course. I hear her. George frowned. Who? Maria, the boy whispered. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear her singing. George froze. Danny, she says, be brave, like before. You remember? His father stared, unable to breathe. When do you hear her? Danny shrugged. Mostly at night, when I get scared. George put an arm around him. That's just your memory, son. Sometimes we remember people's voices when we miss them. Danny shook his head. No, Dad, it's real. She tells me things, like to be kind, to say thank you, and to tell you not to be sad. George's hand trembled slightly. She said that? The boy nodded earnestly. She said you're trying too hard to understand when you should just be grateful. George looked away, his throat tight. You should sleep, Danny. The boy nodded. But as he walked out, he turned and said softly, She's not mad, Dad. She still prays for us. George sat there long after his son was gone, staring at the pendant sitting on the nightstand, the one Victoria had found under Danny's pillow the morning after Maria left. He picked it up slowly, turning it over in his hands. The faint symbol at the center shimmered faintly under the lamplight. Something stirred in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, George did something no one expected. He canceled his meetings, got in his car, and drove out of the city. He didn't tell Victoria where he was going. He just followed the address Maria had once listed on her employment form, a small town 2 hours away. When he arrived, the air was different, quieter, simpler. He stopped by a local grocery store and asked about her. Maria Alvarez? The old cashier repeated. Oh, honey. She passed a long time ago. George's world stopped. What? The woman nodded slowly. About 6 years now. She used to live down the road with her mama before she got sick. Her mother still lives there, I think. Sweet lady. George felt the blood drain from his face. No, that can't be right. I just... The cashier gave him a puzzled look. You okay, sir? He nodded weakly. Where's her mother's house? She gave him directions, and he drove slowly, barely breathing. His hands shook on the steering wheel. When he reached the small white cottage, an elderly woman was watering flowers in the yard. She looked up as he stepped out of the car. Can I help you? She asked kindly. He swallowed hard. Ma'am, I'm looking for Maria Alvarez. The woman's expression softened with sorrow. You knew my daughter? He nodded slowly. She worked for me. The old woman set her watering can down, eyes glistening. Then you must be Mr. Martins. George blinked. You know me? She spoke of you, the woman said, smiling faintly. Said you were a good man who just forgot how to believe. He felt tears prick his eyes. She died 6 years ago? Yes, the woman said quietly. In an accident. She was working for a family in the city. Said she wanted to save money to help children with hearing problems. She never came home. George stepped back, shaking his head. That's not possible. She's alive. She worked in my house. She healed my son. The old woman's eyes filled with tears. Your son was deaf? Yes, but now he can hear because of her. The woman smiled through her tears. Then I guess she kept her promise. George stared at her. Promise? She used to say, the woman whispered, that if God ever gave her a second chance, she'd come back to help one more child hear again. George's knees almost gave out. He looked at the pendant still in his hand, trembling. Ma'am, he said, voice breaking, this pendant, it belonged to her? The old woman nodded slowly. That was Maria's. She never took it off. He stared at it, the same one that had glowed in his house, the same one he'd told her to remove. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled the flowers, and the air felt heavy with something both beautiful and painful. When George finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I didn't believe her. I doubted her. And yet she still saved my son. The old woman placed a trembling hand on his arm. That's what she did, son. She saved people who didn't believe they could be saved. He couldn't stop the tears now. They came quietly, freely. As he walked back to his car, the world around him felt different, sharper, alive. He looked up at the sky and whispered, Thank you, Maria. That evening, back in Los Angeles, Victoria found George sitting beside Danny's bed, holding the pendant. You found her? She asked softly. He nodded slowly, eyes glistening. I found where she used to live. Victoria's breath caught. Used to? He turned toward her, voice shaking. She died. 6 years ago. Victoria's eyes widened. What? She's been gone all this time, Vic, but she came to us. Somehow, she came back. Tears filled Victoria's eyes. How is that possible? I don't know, George whispered. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the miracle wasn't just for Danny. What do you mean? He looked at her, voice trembling. Maybe it was for me too, to remember what faith feels like. Victoria took his hand gently. Then keep believing, for both of us. Danny stirred in his sleep, smiling faintly. For a second, a soft hum, a lullaby, filled the room. It wasn't from any device. It was gentle, distant, familiar. George looked around, eyes wide. Do you hear that? Victoria nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Yes. It was Maria's voice, faint, warm, and fading like a breeze. Be brave, it whispered. The pendant shimmered once more, then went still. The next morning, the sunlight poured through the windows like a quiet promise. For the first time in years, the Martins' mansion didn't feel cold. George sat on the porch, the pendant clutched in his hand, watching his son chase a butterfly across the lawn. Danny's laughter echoed, real, bright, alive. Every sound he made was a miracle in itself. Victoria came out holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to George and sat beside him, her eyes soft. He's so happy, she whispered. George nodded. He used to sit in silence for hours. Now he talks to everything, the trees, the wind, even the birds. She smiled faintly. Maria gave him a new world. He looked down at the pendant. And gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Hope. Victoria leaned her head on his shoulder. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just watched Danny run, laughing under the morning sun. When he came back, he carried a small flower he'd picked. Dad, Mom, he said proudly, for you. Victoria took it with a smile, tears glistening. It's beautiful, sweetheart. Danny turned to George. Dad, can I ask you something? Of course, son. Can we go find Maria one day? I want to thank her. George froze. The words caught in his throat. Victoria's eyes filled instantly. He took a deep breath and said softly, We can't, buddy. She's gone. Danny frowned. Gone where? George hesitated. To a place where kind people rest. The boy's lips trembled. But she talks to me sometimes. George smiled gently. Then maybe she never really left. Danny's face brightened, and he nodded. Yeah, I think so too. He ran off again, his laughter ringing across the garden. George sat still, overwhelmed by a deep ache, but also peace. Later that evening, the family gathered in the living room. Danny sat between his parents, playing a soft tune on the piano, something he'd been learning since regaining his hearing. His small fingers pressed the keys gently, and though the notes were clumsy, the sound filled the room with warmth. Victoria wiped her eyes. He's so determined. George smiled faintly. He reminds me of her. After dinner, as the night grew quiet, Danny asked if they could light a candle. For Maria, he said. They placed it by the window. The flame flickered softly. George whispered, Thank you, Maria, for everything. And for a brief moment, just a heartbeat, the pendant on the table shimmered again as if acknowledging the words. Victoria gasped quietly and Danny grinned. See, she heard you. George chuckled through tears. Yeah, maybe she did. Then Danny turned toward the camera, his innocent face glowing in the candlelight. I was born deaf, he said softly. People said I'd never hear my mom's voice, but someone believed when no one else did. Her name was Maria. He smiled. If you're watching this, don't stop believing in good people. Sometimes miracles are just love wearing a face we didn't expect. He leaned closer, his voice tender. And if you believe in miracles too, tell us in the comments. Like this video so more people can hear our story. And don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the stories we share give someone else the courage to hope again. The music swelled softly in the background, a piano melody, light and peaceful. Victoria put her arm around Danny. You're growing up so fast, she said, kissing his hair. George nodded, smiling proudly. You're our miracle. Danny looked up at him and said, No, Dad, Maria was. The camera lingered on his small hand, touching the glowing pendant. Outside, the wind blew gently, rustling the trees, and somewhere faintly, a woman's voice whispered, Be brave. The candle flickered one last time before the screen faded to black. Then the narrator's voice returned, calm and heartfelt. Some stories aren't just about what we see, but what we choose to believe. This was one family's reminder that faith and love can move mountains, even the ones inside us. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below and share your own story of hope. And don't forget, Subscribe, like, and keep believing, because miracles might just be waiting at your door.